Colonel Sarah Mitchell had always known that respect in the military wasn't something that came with the uniform alone. At 38, she had spent nearly 2 decades climbing through the ranks of the United States Army, earning every stripe, every star, and every commendation through blood, sweat, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. Her journey hadn't been easy, especially as a woman in a field dominated by men, but she had never let obstacles define her limits. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Joint Base Andrews as Sarah walked toward the main briefing hall. Her uniform was immaculate, each crease sharp enough to cut paper, her boots polished to a mirror shine. The weight of her rank insignia felt familiar on her shoulders, a reminder of the countless hours of training, the sleepless nights studying strategy, and the difficult decisions that had shaped her into the officer she was today. Sarah's background was far from typical for someone of her rank. Born in a small town in Montana, she had grown up on a ranch where hard work wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who never spoke much about his service, had taught her that actions spoke louder than words. Her mother, a school teacher, had instilled in her the importance of education and persistence. When Sarah announced at 17 that she wanted to join the military, her parents had been supportive but worried. They knew their daughter was strong, but they also knew the challenges she would face. Military Academy had been Sarah's first real test. Surrounded by cadets who questioned whether a woman belonged among their ranks, she had to prove herself daily. She excelled in academics, finishing in the top 5% of her class. In physical training, she pushed herself beyond limits she never knew existed. When her male counterparts struggled with endurance runs, Sarah was often leading the pack. When they questioned her ability to handle weapons, she consistently scored among the highest in marksmanship. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to lead not through intimidation or volume, but through competence and respect. Her early years as a second lieutenant have been a constant battle against preconceptions. Some senior officers treated her like a novelty, others like a liability. She remembers one particular incident during her first deployment to Afghanistan, when a gruff sergeant major had openly questioned her tactical decision during a briefing. Instead of backing down, Sarah had calmly walked to the map, pointed out the terrain features that supported her strategy, and explained her reasoning with such clarity that even her harshest critics had to acknowledge her competence. That moment had taught her that confidence backed by knowledge was a powerful combination. As she progressed through the ranks, Sarah developed a reputation for being fair but firm. She didn't ask her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do herself. During a particularly dangerous mission in Iraq, when her unit was pinned down by enemy fire, she had personally led the flanking maneuver that allowed them to complete their objective and return home safely. The Bronze Star she received for that action wasn't just a piece of metal to her. It represented the trust her soldiers had placed in her leadership and her commitment to bringing them home. Sarah's rise through the ranks hadn't been meteoric, but it had been steady and well-earned. Each promotion came with new challenges and greater responsibilities. As a captain, she had commanded a company of over 100 soldiers. As a major, she had served on division staff, learning the intricate details of military logistics and planning. Her promotion to lieutenant colonel had brought command of a battalion, where she had proven her ability to manage not just tactical operations, but the complex human dynamics that came with leading over 600 personnel. The day she received her colonel's eagles was one of the proudest moments of her life. Standing in front of her family, her mentors, and her soldiers, she had felt the weight of responsibility that came with senior leadership. Colonel was a rank that demanded respect, not just from subordinates, but from peers and even from members of other services. It was a rank that signified not just military competence, but strategic thinking and the ability to operate at the highest levels of command. But respect, Sarah had learned, wasn't automatically granted based on rank alone. It had to be earned through actions, decisions, and the way one carried oneself. She had seen officers with higher ranks lose credibility through poor judgment or arrogance, while others with lower ranks commanded respect through their competence and character. The military might be built on hierarchy, but true leadership transcended simple rank structure. As she approached the briefing hall, Sarah's mind was focused on the day's agenda. She was attending a joint services conference, where representatives from all branches of the military would discuss coordination strategies for an upcoming international exercise. These conferences were always challenging, as different services had different cultures, different priorities, and sometimes different approaches to the same problems. Her role was to represent the Army's perspective while finding common ground with her Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps counterparts. The briefing hall was already filling with officers when Sarah entered. She recognized several faces from previous joint operations, nodding politely to colleagues she had worked with before. The atmosphere was professional but relaxed, the kind of environment where seasoned officers could discuss complex issues without the formality that characterized more official ceremonies. Sarah found her assigned seat and began reviewing her notes. The first session would focus on logistics coordination, a topic she knew well from her years in staff positions. The second session would address intelligence sharing protocols, always a sensitive subject when multiple agencies were involved. The final session of the day would cover operational planning, where her tactical experience will be most valuable. As other attendees continued to arrive, Sarah noticed a group of Navy SEALs entering the hall. Their distinctive uniforms and confident bearing marked them immediately as members of one of the military's most elite units. SEALs had a well-deserved reputation for excellence in special operations, and their presence at the conference indicated that Special Forces coordination would likely be a significant topic of discussion. Among the SEALs was a man who immediately drew attention through his commanding presence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that suggested both physical capability and tactical expertise, he moved through the room with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge. His uniform displayed the insignia of a lieutenant commander, a rank that in the Navy was equivalent to a major in the Army. While certainly a respectable rank, it was 2 full grades below Sarah's position as a colonel. Sarah watched as the SEAL officer interacted with others in the room. His voice carried easily across the space, and she could hear him discussing various operations with the kind of detailed knowledge that came from personal experience. There was no question that he was competent in his field, but there was also something in his manner that suggested he might not be entirely comfortable in this more formal, joint service environment. The conference was called to order, and Sarah turned her attention to the presentations. The first speaker, an Air Force general, outlined the scope of the upcoming exercise and the importance of seamless coordination between services. As he spoke, Sarah took detailed notes, already thinking about how the Army's capabilities could best support the overall mission. During a break between sessions, Sarah found herself near the refreshment table when the SEAL lieutenant commander approached. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his early 30s. His uniform bore the insignia of someone who had seen significant action, including several combat decorations that spoke to his operational experience. The conversation that followed would prove to be a defining moment, not just for the conference, but for Sarah's understanding of how some people still viewed women in positions of military authority. What started as what should have been a routine professional interaction between 2 officers was about to become something much more significant. The lieutenant commander's first words were casual enough, but there was something in his tone that immediately put Sarah on alert. It wasn't quite disrespectful, but it wasn't the tone typically used when addressing a senior officer. As their conversation continued, it became clear that he either didn't recognize her rank or was choosing not to acknowledge it appropriately. Sarah had encountered the situation before, though not often at this level of seniority. Some officers, particularly those from the more traditional special operations community, sometimes struggled to adjust their expectations when encountering women in leadership positions. Usually, a polite correction was sufficient to address any misunderstanding. However, this situation was developing into something more problematic. The lieutenant commander's comments began to take on a more dismissive tone. He questioned whether someone with her background could truly understand the complexities of special operations. He suggested that joint planning sessions were better left to officers who had real combat experience, a comment that revealed his ignorance of Sarah's extensive deployment history. Most problematically, he began to speak to her as if she were a junior officer, using the kind of condescending tone that no colonel should ever have to endure from a lieutenant commander. Other officers in the immediate vicinity began to notice the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, recognizing that they were witnessing a serious breach of military protocol. Others seemed curious about how Sarah would respond to this unprecedented disrespect. The room's energy was shifting as more people became aware that something significant was happening. Sarah's initial response was measured and professional. she calmly corrected the lieutenant commander's assumptions about her experience and qualifications. She pointed out that rank in the military exists for important reasons, and that proper military courtesy should be observed regardless of personal opinions. Her tone was firm but not hostile, giving the SEAL officer multiple opportunities to recognize his error and correct his behavior. Unfortunately, the lieutenant commander seemed to interpret Sarah's measured response as weakness rather than professionalism. Instead of acknowledging his mistake, he doubled down on his disrespectful behavior. His comments became more explicitly dismissive of her rank and position. He suggested that her colonel's eagles were more a product of political correctness than military competence. He questioned whether she had ever made decisions that put lives at risk, apparently unaware of her combat leadership record. The situation was rapidly escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding into a serious disciplinary incident. Other officers in the room were now openly watching the confrontation, and the professional atmosphere of the conference was being disrupted by one officer's inexplicable behavior toward a senior colleague. Sarah realized that this had moved beyond a matter of personal disrespect and was now affecting the professional environment of the entire conference. Her response would need to address not just the immediate behavior, but also set appropriate expectations for how senior officers should be treated regardless of gender. The moment required both firmness and dignity, and Sarah had to make decisions that would affect not just her own standing, but the perception of women in senior military positions generally. What happened next would depend on factors beyond Sarah's control, but her response to this unprecedented situation would demonstrate the kind of leadership and composure that had earned her the rank of colonel. The lieutenant commander had created a situation that would require resolution at the highest levels, and the consequences of his actions were about to become apparent to everyone in the room. The tension in the briefing hall had become palpable as Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan continued his inappropriate confrontation with Colonel Sarah Mitchell. What had started as a professional conference was rapidly deteriorating into a spectacle that would be remembered long after the scheduled presentations were forgotten. Other officers in the room found themselves in the uncomfortable position of witnessing a serious breach of military protocol, unsure whether to intervene or allow the situation to resolve itself. Jake Sullivan's background explained, though it didn't excuse his behavior. At 32, he had spent the last decade in the insular world of naval special warfare, where rank often mattered less than operational capability and where the traditional military hierarchy sometimes took second place to mission effectiveness. He had enlisted straight out of high school from a small town in Texas, driven by a desire to prove himself among the military's elite. His journey through basic underwater demolition/SEAL training had been grueling, with a failure rate that exceeded 90%, but Jake had possessed the combination of physical toughness and mental resilience needed to succeed. His operational record was impressive by any standard. Multiple deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and various other locations where American Special Operations Forces conducted sensitive missions had given him extensive combat experience. He had participated in high-value target raids, direct action missions, and counterterrorism operations that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. His fellow SEALs respected him for his tactical proficiency and his willingness to take on the most dangerous assignments. However, Jake's world had been largely populated by other special operations personnel, mostly men who shared similar backgrounds and experiences. His interactions with conventional military officers had been limited, and his exposure to women in senior leadership positions had been almost non-existent. This isolation had created blind spots in his understanding of the broader military culture and the changes that had occurred as women had increasingly taken on leadership roles throughout the armed forces. The SEAL community's culture emphasized performance over protocol in many situations. In the field, a junior enlisted sailor with superior knowledge of a particular technique or location might provide guidance to senior officers without regard for traditional hierarchy. This culture had served the SEALs well in operational environments, but it had also given some personnel like Jake the mistaken impression that rank was always secondary to perceived competence or experience. Jake's error was compounded by his assumptions about Colonel Mitchell's background. Seeing a woman in a senior Army position, he had unconsciously assumed that her career path had been different from his own, that she might have advanced through administrative roles rather than operational commands. These assumptions revealed not just his ignorance of her actual record, but Also his unconscious bias about women's capabilities in military leadership positions. As the confrontation continued, Jake found himself in an increasingly untenable position. His training had taught him to be decisive and to stand by his convictions, but military protocol demanded that he show appropriate respect to senior officers regardless of personal opinions. The conflict between these principles was creating cognitive dissonance that he was handling poorly. Colonel Mitchell's response to the escalating situation demonstrated the leadership qualities that had earned her senior rank. Rather than responding to disrespect with anger, she maintained her composure while firmly establishing appropriate boundaries. Her voice remained level as she addressed Jake's inappropriate comments, but her tone carried an unmistakable authority that made clear she would not tolerate continued insubordination. "Lieutenant Commander," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the now-quiet briefing hall, "I believe there may be some confusion about the nature of this interaction. I am Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, and I've been serving this country for nearly 20 years. My rank requires certain protocols to be observed, regardless of personal opinions about women in combat or leadership positions." The directness of her statement cut through the tension like a knife. Other officers in the room recognized that Sarah had just given Jake an opportunity to recognize his error and correct his behavior before the situation became irreparable. Her phrasing made it clear that she understood the nature of his disrespect while offering him a face-saving way to acknowledge his mistake. Unfortunately, Jake was too deep into his confrontational stance to recognize the lifeline he was being offered. His response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about both Sarah's qualifications and the seriousness of the situation. "Look, ma'am," he said, his tone still failing to show appropriate respect for her rank. "I'm sure you've had a fine career, but special operations is different from regular Army. We deal with life and death decisions that require a certain kind of experience. I've been in more firefights than I can count, and I've never seen women in those situations." The comment revealed Jake's fundamental ignorance about modern military operations and women's roles in them. His assumption that Sarah lacked combat experience was not only wrong, but insulting to someone who had led soldiers in some of the most dangerous operations of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. More importantly, his continued failure to observe basic military courtesy was becoming a disciplinary matter that would require official attention. Captain Maria Rodriguez, a Marine Corps officer who had served alongside Sarah in Iraq, was among those watching the confrontation with growing concern. She knew Sarah's operational record intimately and was appalled by Jake's ignorant assumptions. Maria had personally witnessed Sarah's tactical decision-making under fire and knew that few officers of any gender possessed Sarah's combination of tactical expertise and leadership ability. Major General Robert Hayes, United States Air Force, was also present in the briefing hall. As one of the senior officers in attendance, he was acutely aware that the situation was spiraling beyond what could be handled through informal correction. Military discipline required that disrespect towards senior officers be addressed formally, and Jake's continued inappropriate behavior was creating a situation that would need official intervention. Also present was Brigadier General Patricia Wong, United States Marine Corps, who had broken numerous barriers herself during her rise to general officer rank. She watched the confrontation with a mixture of professional concern and personal frustration, recognizing that Jake's behavior reflected attitudes that she had hoped were becoming obsolete in the modern military. The fourth senior officer observing the situation was Major General Michael Thompson, United States Army, who had served as Sarah's mentor earlier in her career. He knew her capabilities better than almost anyone and was personally offended by the disrespect being shown to one of the Army's finest officers. As Jake continued his inappropriate comments, these senior officers were reaching the same conclusion. The situation required immediate intervention. The respect due to any colonel was being systematically violated, and the professional environment of the conference was being disrupted by behavior that violated basic military standards. Sarah's next response demonstrated why she had been selected for senior leadership positions. Rather than escalating the confrontation or allowing her emotions to drive her actions, she took a step back and addressed Jake with the kind of measured authority that marked experienced commanders. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," she said, using his name to make clear that this was now an official interaction rather than a casual conversation. "Your comments suggest several misunderstandings about modern military operations, women's roles in combat, and basic military protocol. I'm going to give you one final opportunity to reconsider your approach to this conversation." The formality of her language and the use of his full rank and name sent a clear signal to everyone within hearing distance that this was now an official matter requiring official resolution. Sarah had transitioned from attempting informal correction to formal notification that disciplinary action might be required. Jake's response would determine whether the situation could still be resolved through apology and correction or whether it would require formal action through military channels. Unfortunately, his next words made it clear that he either didn't understand the seriousness of his position or was unwilling to acknowledge his error. "Colonel," he said, finally, using her correct rank but in a tone that suggested sarcasm rather than respect, "I appreciate your position, but I stand by my assessment. Special operations requires a different kind of leader, and I question whether conventional Army experience translates to the kind of decisions we have to make." The comment was the final straw for the senior officers who had been observing the confrontation. Jake had been given multiple opportunities to correct his behavior and had instead chosen to double down on his disrespect. More seriously, his comments had moved beyond simple discourtesy to questioning Sarah's professional competence based on her gender and service branch. Major General Hayes, as the senior Air Force officer present, made the decision to intervene. Military protocol required that disrespect towards senior officers be addressed immediately, and Jake's behavior had crossed every line of acceptable conduct. The general's movement toward the confrontation was noticed by others in the room, and the atmosphere shifted as personnel realized that formal intervention was imminent. At the same time, General Wong was approaching from another direction, her expression making clear that she viewed Jake's behavior as completely unacceptable. As a Marine Corps general who had faced her own struggles with gender-based discrimination, she was particularly sensitive to the kind of disrespect that Jake was showing. General Thompson, as an Army general and Sarah's former mentor, was also moving to address the situation. His personal knowledge of Sarah's capabilities made Jake's comments particularly offensive to him, and his expression suggested that formal disciplinary action was likely to follow. Brigadier General Wong, though the junior general among the four, was equally determined to address the inappropriate behavior she was witnessing. Her own experiences with gender-based discrimination in the military made her particularly aware of the importance of addressing Jake's comments immediately and definitively. The convergence of four general officers toward the confrontation sent a clear signal throughout the briefing hall that something unprecedented was occurring. Lower-ranking personnel began to realize that they were witnessing a moment that would have significant consequences for everyone involved. Jake, focused on his confrontation with Sarah, was initially unaware of the approaching generals. His attention was entirely focused on what he perceived as a debate about operational competence rather than recognizing it as a serious breach of military discipline that was about to result in formal consequences. The moment when Jake would finally become aware of the approaching general officers would mark a turning point in his understanding of the situation he had created. The respect and protocol he had dismissed as unimportant were about to be demonstrated in a way that would leave no doubt about the seriousness of his error. What happened next would serve as a powerful reminder that military rank and protocol exist for important reasons, and that disrespect towards senior officers, regardless of gender, would not be tolerated at any level of the armed forces. The lesson was about to be delivered by four of the military's most senior leaders, and it would be one that everyone present would remember for the rest of their careers. The moment when Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan finally became aware of the four general officers approaching his position would be seared into the memory of everyone present in that briefing hall. What had started as Jake's misguided attempt to assert his operational credibility over what he perceived as a conventional Army officer was about to transform into a lesson in military hierarchy, respect, and the consequences of poor judgment. Jake's first indication that something had changed came from the sudden silence that had fallen over the room. Conversations that had been continuing despite the confrontation had stopped entirely, and he could sense movement behind him that suggested people were repositioning themselves to observe whatever was about to happen. The attention of every person in the briefing hall was now focused on the small area where he stood facing Colonel Mitchell. When Jake finally turned to see what had captured everyone's attention, he found himself facing a situation that no amount of SEAL training had prepared him for. Approaching from different directions, with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to barely contained anger, were four general officers representing three different branches of the United States military. The sight of so much senior leadership converging on his position sent a shock through his system that was more powerful than any combat adrenaline he had ever experienced. Major General Robert Hayes reached the group first, his Air Force uniform bearing the distinctive eagles of his rank and ribbons that spoke to decades of distinguished service. At 55, General Hayes had commanded everything from fighter squadrons to entire air wings, and his presence carried the authority of someone who had made life and death decisions affecting thousands of personnel. His expression as he approached Jake was one of professional displeasure mixed with genuine bewilderment at the behavior he had witnessed. "Lieutenant Commander," General Hayes said, his voice carrying the kind of command authority that had controlled complex air operations across multiple theaters of war, "I believe introductions are in order. I am Major General Hayes, United States Air Force, and I have been observing your interaction with Colonel Mitchell with considerable interest." Before Jake could respond, Major General Michael Thompson arrived at the group, his Army uniform immediately identifying him as a peer of Colonel Mitchell's service branch. General Thompson's personal knowledge of Sarah's capabilities and his role as her former mentor made Jake's disrespectful comments particularly offensive to him. At 58, Thompson had commanded divisions in both Iraq and Afghanistan and had been instrumental in developing many of the modern Army's leadership development programs. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," General Thompson said, his tone carrying decades of command experience, "I am Major General Thompson, United States Army. Colonel Mitchell served under my command earlier in her career, and I can personally attest her tactical competence and leadership ability. I'm curious about the basis for your assessment of her qualifications." The arrival of the two Army generals was followed immediately by Brigadier General Patricia Wong, United States Marine Corps, whose own journey to general officer rank had required overcoming many of the same prejudices that Jake had been displaying toward Sarah. General Wong's expression suggested that she viewed Jake's behavior not just as a breach of protocol, but as a personal affront to every woman who had served in the military with distinction. "Lieutenant Commander," General Wong said, her voice carrying the precision that had made her one of the Marine Corps' most respected logistical planners, "I am Brigadier General Wong, United States Marine Corps. Your comments about women in combat suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of modern military operations. Perhaps you would like to clarify your position." The fourth general officer to arrive was Major General David Martinez, United States Army, whose specialized background in special operations made him particularly qualified to address Jake's claims about combat experience and tactical expertise. General Martinez had commanded special operations units at every level and had personal knowledge of many classified operations that Jake would never be clear to know about. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," General Martinez said, his quiet tone somehow more intimidating than if he had shouted, "I am Major General Martinez, United States Army Special Operations Command. I'm interested in discussing your perspective on combat experience and leadership qualifications." The presence of four general officers surrounding him created a situation that Jake's SEAL training had never anticipated. In combat, he had faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and life-threatening situations with calm professionalism. But standing before four of the military's most senior leaders, knowing that his career was likely hanging in the balance, created a different kind of stress entirely. The realization of what he had done began to dawn on Jake as he looked from one general officer to another. Each represented years of distinguished service and possessed authority that extended far beyond anything he had ever wielded. More importantly, their presence made it clear that his disrespect toward Colonel Mitchell had not gone unnoticed and would not be overlooked. General Hayes, as the senior officer present, took the lead in addressing the situation that Jake's behavior had created. His approach was methodical and professional, designed to ensure that everyone present understood both the seriousness of the breach of protocol and the appropriate response to such behavior. "Lieutenant Commander," General Hayes began, "military protocol exists for important reasons. The respect shown to senior officers is not based on personal opinion or individual assessment, but on the rank structure that maintains order and discipline throughout our armed forces. Your interaction with Colonel Mitchell appears to have violated these basic principles." Jake's mouth fell dry as he attempted to formulate a response. The confidence that had driven his confrontational behavior with Sarah had evaporated entirely in the face of such senior military authority. He was beginning to understand that what he had perceived as a professional debate was actually a serious disciplinary matter with potentially career-ending consequences. "Sir," Jake managed, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized his earlier comments, "I may have misunderstood the nature of our conversation. I intended no disrespect to Colonel Mitchell's rank." General Thompson's response made it clear that Jake's attempt to minimize his behavior would not be accepted. The general's personal knowledge of Sarah's record made him particularly well-positioned to address Jake's ignorant assumptions about her capabilities. "Lieutenant Commander," General Thompson said, "Colonel Mitchell has commanded units in some of the most dangerous operations of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. Her tactical decisions have directly resulted in mission success and saved countless lives. Your suggestion that she lacks combat experience reveals a fundamental ignorance of her record that is frankly embarrassing for an officer of your position." The correction was delivered with the kind of authority that left no room for argument or further attempts at justification. General Thompson's words made it clear that Jake's assumptions about Sarah's background were not only wrong, but offensively so. General Wong's contribution to the conversation focused on the broader implications of Jake's behavior, particularly his comments about women in combat roles. Her own experiences with gender-based discrimination made her uniquely qualified to address the attitudes that Jake had displayed. "Lieutenant Commander," General Wong said, "your comment about women in combat suggests that you are unaware of the contributions that women have made to military operations for decades. Women have served with distinction in every recent conflict, and many have given their lives in service to this country. Your dismissal of their capabilities is not only factually incorrect, but professionally unacceptable." General Martinez's expertise in special operations allowed him to address Jake's claims about the unique requirements of his field and the suggestion that conventional military experience was somehow inferior to special operations service. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," General Martinez said, "special operations certainly requires specific skills and training, but it does not exist in isolation from the broader military structure. The most successful special operations leaders understand that their capabilities are enhanced by, not separate from, conventional military expertise. Colonel Mitchell's background includes experiences that would benefit any special operations mission." The combined weight of correction from four general officers created a moment of profound realization for Jake. Each had addressed a different aspect of his inappropriate behavior, and together they had systematically dismantled every justification he had offered for his disrespectful treatment of Sarah. The silence that followed the general's statements was profound. Every person in the briefing hall was acutely aware that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Jake's public humiliation was complete, but, more importantly, a clear message was being sent about the military's commitment to treating all officers with the respect their rank required. Colonel Mitchell, who had remained silent during the general's intervention, now found herself in the position of having to respond to this unprecedented show of support. The four general officers had not only corrected Jake's behavior, but had also validated her position and capabilities in the most public way possible. "Thank you, generals," Sarah said, her voice carrying gratitude, but also the strength that had earned her senior rank. "I appreciate your intervention and your support. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, I hope this experience will help clarify appropriate protocols for future interactions with senior officers." Her response was professional and measured, showing no vindictiveness toward Jake despite the disrespect he had shown her. It was the response of a leader who understood that discipline was about correction and education, not revenge or humiliation. Jake's final response to the situation would determine whether this incident would be remembered as a learning experience or as the end of his military career. The four general officers were watching him carefully, assessing whether his behavior suggested a fundamental character flaw or simply a serious error in judgment that could be corrected through appropriate consequences and education. The moment had arrived for Jake to demonstrate whether he possessed the maturity and professionalism required for continued service at his level. His next words would either begin the process of repairing the damage he had caused or confirm that his attitudes were incompatible with military service at any level. What happened next would determine not only Jake's future, but also send a message throughout the military about the consequences of disrespecting senior officers and the importance of treating all personnel with the dignity their service and rank required. The weight of four general officers' attention bore down on Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan like a physical force as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of his error. Standing in the center of what had become an impromptu disciplinary proceeding, Jake felt the eyes of every person in the briefing hall focused on his response to the most humbling moment of his military career. The confidence and arrogance that had driven his confrontation with Colonel Mitchell had been completely shattered by the intervention of the senior leadership, leaving him to grapple with the realization that his career hung in the balance. Jake's military training had instilled in him the importance of taking responsibility for his actions, even when the consequences were severe. As a SEAL, he had been taught that accountability was fundamental to unit cohesion and mission success. However, applying these principles in the current situation required him to acknowledge not just tactical errors, but fundamental flaws in his character and judgment that went far beyond simple mistakes. The silence stretching across the briefing hall was deafening. Jake could hear his own heartbeat as he looked from one general officer to another, seeing in their expressions a mixture of disappointment, anger, and professional judgment. These were leaders who had commanded thousands of personnel, made decisions affecting national security, and maintained the standards that kept the military functioning as an effective force. Their presence here was not just about correcting his behavior towards Sarah, but about upholding the principles that made military service possible. General Hayes, as the senior officer present, maintained his position directly in front of Jake, his expression making it clear that some form of response was required. The general's decades of experience had taught him to recognize when subordinates were struggling with difficult realizations, but also when situations required immediate resolution. This was clearly one of those moments when military discipline demanded swift and appropriate action. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, General Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded at the highest levels, "You have been presented with significant information about Colonel Mitchell's qualifications and service record. You have also been reminded of the protocols that govern interactions between officers of different ranks. I am waiting for your response to this situation." The directness of the general's words cut through Jake's confusion and forced him to confront the choice before him. He could attempt to justify his behavior further, which would likely result in formal disciplinary action and possible court-martial proceedings, or he could acknowledge his errors and hope that his previously unblemished record would earn him a chance at redemption. Jake's response came slowly, his voice lacking any trace of the confidence that had characterized his earlier comments. "Sir, I have made serious errors in judgment today. My comments to Colonel Mitchell were inappropriate and based on ignorance of her record and qualifications. I have violated basic military protocol and shown disrespect to a senior officer who deserved better treatment." The acknowledgement was a beginning, but the general's expressions made it clear that more would be required. Jake's admission of error was necessary, but not sufficient to address the full scope of his inappropriate behavior. The attitudes he had displayed toward women in the military and his dismissal of conventional Army capabilities suggested deeper issues that would need to be addressed. General Thompson, whose personal knowledge of Sarah's record made him particularly offended by Jake's behavior, stepped forward to address the broader implications of the lieutenant commander's actions. "Lieutenant Commander, your comments suggest that you harbor significant misconceptions about women's capabilities in military leadership and combat roles. These attitudes are not only factually incorrect, but potentially dangerous to unit cohesion and mission effectiveness." The general's words forced Jake to confront the reality that his behavior had revealed problematic attitudes that extended far beyond this single incident. His assumptions about women in the military had been shaped by limited exposure and unconscious bias, but ignorance was not an acceptable excuse for the kind of disrespect he had shown to a senior officer. "Sir," Jake replied, his voice stronger now as he began to grasp the full scope of what he needed to address. "You are correct that my attitudes toward women in military leadership positions have been shaped by limited exposure and incorrect assumptions. I understand now that these attitudes are not only wrong, but harmful to the military's mission and to the individuals who serve with distinction regardless of gender." General Wong, whose own journey to general officer rank had required overcoming similar prejudices, recognized the importance of ensuring that Jake truly understood the impact of his behavior. Her response focused on the practical implications of his attitudes and the need for genuine change rather than simply politically correct statements. "Lieutenant Commander," General Wong said, Understanding the problem intellectually is only the first step. The military requires officers who can work effectively with personnel of all backgrounds and who can recognize capability and leadership regardless of gender, race, or service branch. Your behavior today suggests that you may struggle with these requirements. Jake's response to General Wong's challenge would be crucial in determining whether the generals viewed him as capable of genuine change or as someone whose attitudes were fundamentally incompatible with modern military service. The personal nature of her comments, reflecting her own experiences with discrimination, made her assessment particularly significant. "Ma'am," Jake said, using the correct form of address and showing more respect than he had displayed at any point during the confrontation, "I recognize that my attitudes need to change fundamentally, not just superficially. I understand that effective military service requires the ability to recognize and respect competence and leadership in all forms, and I have clearly failed to meet that standard today." General Martinez, whose special operations background gave him unique credibility in addressing Jake's claims about combat experience and tactical expertise, focused his comments on the SEALs' fundamental misunderstanding of how special operations fit within the broader military structure. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," General Martinez said, "your comment about special operations being fundamentally different from conventional military service reveal a dangerous misunderstanding of how our armed forces function. The most effective special operations units understand that their success depends on integration with conventional forces, intelligence services, and support personnel from all branches and backgrounds." The correction from a general officer with impeccable special operations credentials carried particular weight with Jake. General Martinez's words made it clear that Jake's attitudes were not shared by the senior leadership of his own community and that his behavior had violated the professional standards expected of special operations personnel. "Sir," Jake responded, "I understand that my comments reflected a narrow and incorrect view of how special operations fits within the broader military structure. I see now that my isolation within my own community has created blind spots that have affected my judgment and professional behavior." Colonel Mitchell, who had remained silent during much of the general's intervention, now felt it appropriate to address Jake directly. Her response would be watched carefully by everyone present, as it would demonstrate her leadership style and her commitment to the military's values of professionalism and growth through correction. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of her rank, but also a measured tone that suggested she understood the difference between correction and humiliation. "I appreciate your acknowledgement of the errors you have made. However, words alone will not be sufficient to address the damage that has been done here today." Her statement made it clear that while she accepted Jake's apology, she also understood that meaningful change would require more than verbal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The incident had implications that extended beyond their personal interaction and would require formal resolution. The four general officers exchanged glances that suggested they had reached a consensus about how to proceed with the situation. Their combined experience had taught them that moments like these require decisive action that would serve both as appropriate consequence for inappropriate behavior and as a learning opportunity that could benefit everyone involved. General Hayes, speaking for the group, addressed both Jake and the broader audience that had witnessed the confrontation. "Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, your behavior today has violated basic military protocols and displayed attitudes that are inconsistent with the values of our armed forces. This incident will require formal documentation and review through appropriate channels." The announcement that formal action would be taken sent a clear message throughout the briefing hall that the military senior leadership took such incidents seriously and that appropriate consequences would follow regardless of the offender's previous record or special operations background. However, General Hayes continued with words that suggested the generals viewed this as an opportunity for education rather than simply punishment. "Lieutenant Commander, your acknowledgement of error and apparent willingness to address the underlying attitudes that caused this incident will be taken into consideration as we determine appropriate corrective actions." The balanced approach reflected the military's commitment to developing personnel rather than simply punishing mistakes, while also making clear that consequences for inappropriate behavior would be real and significant. Jake's final response to the general's statements would determine how this incident would be remembered and what impact it would have on his future military service. The room remained silent as everyone waited to see whether he had truly learned from the humbling experience or whether his acknowledgments were simply attempts to minimize consequences. "Sirs and ma'am," Jake said, addressing all four general officers with proper respect, "I understand that formal action is appropriate and necessary. I am committed to whatever corrective measures you determine are needed, and I will use this experience to become a better officer and a better person. I particularly want to apologize to Colonel Mitchell for the disrespect I showed, and to thank all of you for taking the time to correct my behavior and attitudes." The sincerity in Jake's voice and his willingness to accept consequences without further justification suggested that the intervention had achieved its intended effect. The general officer's expressions showed cautious optimism that the incident could serve as a learning experience rather than requiring more severe disciplinary action. What would happen next would determine whether this confrontation would be remembered as a moment of successful correction and growth or as a cautionary tale about the consequences of prejudice and disrespect in the modern military. The aftermath of Lieutenant Commander Jake Sullivan's public humiliation and correction by four general officers would resonate through the military community far beyond that briefing hall at Joint Base Andrews. What had begun as a joint services conference had transformed into a defining moment that would influence policies, training programs, and individual attitudes throughout the armed forces. The ripple effects of that single confrontation would ultimately touch thousands of military personnel and fundamentally change how the services approached issues of respect, diversity, and professional conduct. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, the four general officers coordinated their response with the precision that had characterized their military careers. General Hayes, as the senior officer present, took responsibility for ensuring that appropriate documentation was completed and that all relevant command were notified of the incident. The formal report would become a case study in military leadership schools for years to come, demonstrating both the consequences of inappropriate behavior and the importance of senior leadership intervention when basic standards were violated. General Thompson's role in the follow-up was particularly significant given his personal relationship with Colonel Mitchell and his position within the Army's leadership development community. He recognized that the incident represented an opportunity to reinforce important messages about respect, competence, and the changing nature of military leadership. His recommendations would influence how the Army addressed similar situations in the future and would contribute to ongoing discussions about creating more inclusive military environments. General Wong's perspective as a Marine Corps officer who had faced her own challenges with gender-based discrimination brought additional depth to the response. Her insights about the systemic nature of the attitudes that Jake had displayed led to recommendations for enhanced sensitivity training and more aggressive intervention when inappropriate behavior was observed. Her influence would be particularly felt in the development of new protocols for addressing discrimination and harassment. General Martinez's special operations background allowed him to address the incident within the SEAL community specifically. His recommendations focused on ensuring that special operations personnel understood that their elite status did not exempt them from basic military protocols and that their isolation from conventional forces should not create attitudes of superiority or disrespect toward other service members. For Jake Sullivan himself, the immediate consequences were both professional and personal. The formal documentation of his inappropriate behavior would become part of his permanent record, affecting future promotion opportunities and assignments. More importantly, he was required to undergo extensive counseling and training designed to address the underlying attitudes that had led to his confrontation with Colonel Mitchell. Jake's commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Foster, was notified of the incident within hours of its occurrence. Captain Foster had previously considered Jake one of her most reliable subordinates, and learning of his behavior came as a shock that forced her to re-evaluate her assessment of his character and judgment. Her subsequent counseling sessions with Jake would focus not just on correcting his immediate behavior, but on understanding how such attitudes could develop and persist without being detected by his chain of command. The Navy's response to the incident extended beyond Jake's individual case to examine broader issues within the SEAL community. Admiral Patricia Wells, who commanded Naval Special Warfare Command, ordered a comprehensive review of training programs, leadership development, and integration protocols to identify and address any systemic issues that might have contributed to Jake's attitudes. Her findings would lead to significant changes in how special operations personnel were prepared for joint service assignments. For Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the incident represented both a personal vindication and a professional opportunity. The public support she had received from 4 general officers validated her position and capabilities in the most visible way possible. However, she also recognized that the incident could serve as a catalyst for broader changes in how women were perceived and treated throughout the military. Sarah's response to the situation demonstrated the leadership qualities that had earned her senior rank. Rather than using the incident to seek personal advantage or to embarrass Jake further, she focused on how the experience could contribute to positive changes in military culture. Her recommendations to Army leadership emphasized the importance of education and prevention rather than simply punishment after problems occurred. The impact on the other officers who witnessed the confrontation was significant and varied. Many saw it as a powerful reminder that inappropriate behavior would not be tolerated regardless of someone's operational record or special qualifications. Others recognized it as evidence that senior leadership was committed to creating more inclusive environments where all personnel could serve with dignity and respect. Captain Maria Rodriguez, who had served with Sarah in Iraq and witnessed her tactical competence firsthand, used the incident as a teaching moment for junior officers under her command. Her discussions about the importance of judging colleagues based on competence rather than assumptions became part of her regular leadership development sessions. Major James Peterson, a relatively junior officer who had watched the entire confrontation, later described it as one of the most educational experiences of his military career. The incident had demonstrated to him the importance of treating all colleagues with appropriate respect and had shown him how quickly professional situations could deteriorate when basic protocols were ignored. The broader military community's reaction to the incident was overwhelmingly positive. News of the confrontation and its resolution spread rapidly through informal networks, creating discussions about respect, competence, and appropriate behavior in units throughout all service branches. Many personnel saw it as evidence that the military was serious about creating environments where everyone could serve effectively regardless of background or gender. However, the incident also revealed the persistence of problematic attitudes within some segments of the military community. While most personnel supported the general's intervention and Jake's correction, a minority questioned whether the response had been proportionate to his behavior. These dissenting voices provided valuable feedback about areas where additional education and training were needed. The long-term changes that resulted from the incident were substantial and far-reaching. The Department of Defense implemented new training requirements for all personnel being assigned to joint service positions, focusing on understanding different service cultures and maintaining appropriate professional behavior across service lines. These programs became mandatory for all officers above the rank of captain or major. Military academies incorporated the incident into their ethics and leadership curricula, using it as a case study in professional behavior, respect, and the consequences of inappropriate conduct. The detailed analysis of what had led to Jake's behavior and how it could have been prevented became required reading for cadets and midshipmen. Special operations communities across all services implemented enhanced training programs designed to prepare personnel for interaction with conventional military units and personnel from different backgrounds. The isolation that had contributed to Jake's problematic attitudes was recognized as a systemic issue requiring deliberate intervention. 6 months after the incident, Jake Sullivan had completed his mandatory counseling and training programs and was serving in a new assignment that required extensive cooperation with conventional Navy units and personnel from other services. His performance reports indicated that the corrective action had been successful and that he had developed more appropriate attitudes toward women in leadership and personnel from other service branches. Jake's personal transformation became another element of the incident's legacy. His willingness to acknowledge his errors, undergo corrective training, and change his behavior demonstrated that even serious attitude problems could be addressed through appropriate intervention and personal commitment to growth. Colonel Sarah Mitchell's career continued to flourish following the incident. Her promotion to Brigadier General was announced 18 months later, making her one of the youngest women to achieve general officer rank in the Army. The promotion was based on her outstanding service record and demonstrated leadership capabilities, but many recognized it as also representing the military's commitment to advancing qualified personnel regardless of the challenges they might have faced. In her promotion ceremony, Sarah acknowledged the incident indirectly by thanking the senior leaders who had supported her throughout her career and by emphasizing her commitment to creating opportunities for all qualified personnel to serve and advance based on their capabilities rather than their backgrounds. The four general officers who had intervened in the original confrontation remained connected to the ongoing changes that resulted from the incident. Their coordinated response had demonstrated the importance of immediate intervention when inappropriate behavior was observed, and their example influenced how other senior leaders handled similar situations. General Hayes retired 2 years after the incident, but remained active in veterans organizations and military education programs. His speeches often referenced the importance of maintaining professional standards and ensuring that all personnel were treated with appropriate dignity and respect. General Thompson's influence on Army leadership development programs continued throughout his remaining years of active service. The training programs he helped develop as a result of the incident became models for other services and were eventually adopted throughout the Department of Defense. General Wong's advocacy for women in the military was strengthened by her role in addressing the incident. Her subsequent assignments included positions where she could influence policy development and implementation across all services, contributing to ongoing efforts to create more inclusive military environments. General Martinez's work within the Special Operations community helped ensure that elite units understood their responsibility to maintain the highest standards of professional conduct while also preserving their operational effectiveness. His balanced approach to addressing the cultural issues revealed by the incident became a model for other communities facing similar challenges. The incident at Joint Base Andrews ultimately served as a catalyst for positive change throughout the military community. It demonstrated that inappropriate behavior would not be tolerated regardless of someone's background or achievements, while also showing that correction and growth were possible when individuals were willing to acknowledge their errors and commit to change. The story became part of military folklore, passed down through generations of personnel as an example of leadership, accountability, and the importance of treating all colleagues with respect and professionalism. It served as a reminder that rank and protocol exist for important reasons, and that the military strength comes from the diversity of backgrounds and perspectives that all personnel bring to their service. Years later, both Sarah Mitchell and Jake Sullivan would speak publicly about the incident and its impact on their careers and personal development. Their perspectives on what had happened and what it had taught them became valuable contributions to ongoing discussions about leadership, respect, and professional growth in the military community. The briefing hall at Joint Base Andrews, where the confrontation had occurred, became an unofficial landmark for discussions about military leadership and professional conduct. The incident that had taken place there served as a powerful reminder that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences and that leadership required constant attention to the dignity and respect that all personnel deserved.